By far, the worst offender is this outer tie rod end. It's absolutely trashed. This is about to come out. Hi everybody, Brandon back here again, and today we are with the 2000 Camaro SS, where we are finally going to be addressing the steering issues on it. Let me show you what we've got going on here today. So I've got a new strut assembly with the shock and spring. I've got upper and lower control arms with the ball joints already in them. I find that these assemblies are a better cost-effective solution than having to change out ball joints on these. I also have new outer tie rod ends along with sway bar end links, and those items on the sway bar end links and the outer tie rods are the Moog parts that come with the greasable fittings along with hardware. So let's get to it. First off, we need to remove the wheel and tire. So since I'm basically redoing the whole front end of this, I'm going to go ahead probably first and undo the outer tie rod end. I'm probably going to undo the sway bar link, all that from the lower control arm, because we'll need to have that disassembled to be able to take that off. And then I'll probably go on to the strut assembly, and we'll need to remove some things up above there to be able to get to two of the top mounting nuts. So first I'm going to take out this sway bar end link from the top. I'm going to undo it with a deep 13mm socket, and that is turning from the bottom, so I need to go ahead and get something to hold that in place. Hang tight. Okay, I'm holding it now from the bottom with the socket, and I went up here with my ratcheting wrench, and I'm going to undo it. Again, this is a 13mm. Not too rusty, because this car has always lived its life in California. If you live in a place where you find this to be a bit rustier, I recommend you go ahead and put some penetrating fluid on it to help it not to get stripped out or to mess up the threads as you're trying to take it out. Otherwise, this job gets a lot more difficult. Okay, I am going to spray a little bit of lubricant on here just to make this come off a little bit nicer. The threads are a little dirty. And if they're a little tight, one of the tricks you can do is tighten it back up a little bit and then reverse it if you feel like it's getting a little boogered up. And I admit I'm a little impatient, so I'm going to speed this up with power. If you have power tools at home, don't be afraid to use them. Okay, now I'm just going to tap this end link out. I'm not too worried about breaking anything because we're not saving it. Okay, we've got that out. Next, I'm going to go ahead and remove the cotter pin here on our tie rod end, and then I'm going to unbolt the tie rod end. Okay, now that I've got that pulled out a little bit, just going to grab it with the pliers. Try not to knock over the camera. And before I go taking off this tie rod end, I want to check out the new one, make sure that it is the same length. That way when I go to thread this back on and I go to try to match up the position, that I know it has relatively the same alignment that it does now. We're pretty close. So what I'm going to do before I take this off is I'm going to mark with a silver pen the position of where this tie rod end threads onto. That way I know about how much to thread my new one on. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and buzz this off with the 18mm socket. Okay. Okay, that was easy. Now let's see if this ball joint will come out if I just hammer on it softly. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. There we go. Didn't even need to get the sledge on that. As you can see, this thing is totally trashed. It's probably frozen on here. We'll see how tight it is to get off. Need to grab a wrench here, undo this threaded nut, ease the tension here, and then we will be able to take that off. Okay, I've got my 7/8 handy. Let's see if I can bust this off. Okay, I'm gonna let the ball joint be my friend here. Thread this back on for a second. Okay, there we go. Busted loose. Okay, I'm gonna take this out again and start spinning that off. There we go, there's our new and old. Let's get that threaded on. A little bit more room for myself. Let's see if I can knock this out. There we go. Again, our sway bar end link's not looking too good. Before I go undoing everything else here at the steering knuckle attaching to the lower control arm, I think I'm going to go for the bolts that mount the control arm at the back. There's one that points towards the front of the car going that way, and there's one that comes up from underneath. Let's see if I can get a better vantage point of that. So it's roughly up under here, and I want to do that while everything's still attached on this side, so maybe we can just drop that part down. Okay, I've got a 7/8 wrench on one side. I'm going to come in here and try to sneak this 18mm onto this front one. Nope. Okay, so I'm back with you. That took just a little bit of persuasion. With the camera out of the way, so this control arm is about to come out. I'm gonna go ahead and just leave that hanging in there on one side until I drop the back one that goes straight up. So one more thing that I'm gonna do before I go undoing these lower control arm bolts completely is connect this line that's clipped on to our lower control arm, because I don't want it ripping out when we disconnect it. Okay, there we go. So that's free, as you can see. I also have another clip in here I'm gonna have to undo. This is just behind our strut. Okay, now when the strut drops down, I shouldn't have anything that is gonna be messed up because we have our steering knuckle still attached at the top, so that won't let our brake fall. Okay, I also disconnected this little clip, and now I'm gonna go in here with my 7/8 and undo it from the bottom. It was easy. Now, if I get in here, it's kind of awkward, and fish this bolt out. Take my long needle nose, see if I can grab it out of there. Yep. There we go, just pushed it out. Has an indexing tab. That's what it looks like. Now with that out, I'm gonna pull the front mounting bolt out. There it is. This control arm should pull out. Okay. And now, hopefully you can see why I did it this way. I left the steering knuckle attached, and I left our strut attached at the bottom so that our brake caliper and our brake rotor doesn't just fall. So now I'm going to disconnect those. So as before, got to remove our cotter pin before we can take the castle nut off. And these usually break, but even if they don't, it's wise to replace them with a new one. You really should when you go to put this all back together. And normally this isn't that difficult. It's just because I have a camera in my way and I'm trying to explain as I go. There we go. All right, it's out. Our castle nut off. 7/8 actually. Okay, that's loose. And I'm using the wrenches this time just because there's not a lot of room to work. And to give you guys a better view and also to prove that you don't have to have power tools to do this. See if that'll knock out before I undo the strut. Okay, that's loosened up a bit. I'll go ahead and cheat. Okay, that's off. For this one, I'm going to reverse and go from underneath to break it loose because I don't have a lot of room. There we go. Okay. Our strut's fully disconnected. Now our ball joint just drops out. Just need to pry on our control arm. Almost there. And it's out. So as you can see, the bushings in here are shot. That's why it's steering so poorly. So we'll replace that with the new one. Okay, now, before putting the new control arm in there, the bolt that goes up and the front one that goes through both have these indexing tabs. It's easy to see the one adjacent just above, right there, where you see the light coming through. You got to get that mounted in there, and that holds the bolt in place when you put the nut on from the other side. But the same deal is with this, and it's blind. Let me see if I can get the angle here. Come from underneath, just behind that bolt head, you can see there's the tab. So make sure that when you drop the new one in there, that you get it aligned. Okay, so I put the jack under here just to get the front end of my control arm positioned so I could put this front bolt through. And the back one was actually relatively easy. The easiest way to get that tab that I mentioned lined up was actually to just come from the back. I'll take my hammer, see if I can tap this in, down my jack. It's just a little hard to push through because those bushings inside are new and tight, unlike the old ones. There we go. I've got the tab lined up, so it goes all the way through. Now I can put my nut back on from the back. All right, so we are reattached there. At this point, I think I'm gonna go ahead and drop my strut assembly down, place that, bolt it back up to my lower control arm, and get the bottom button back together. Okay, so here's the deal. I went ahead and pushed the lower control arm ball joint up through the bottom of the steering knuckle and just threaded it a little bit. This may seem a little unconventional, but the reason I'm doing it is because I want it to support our brake rotor and our brake caliper that's still attached to our steering knuckle when I detach the steering knuckle from the new upper control arm. Saves me the work of having to hang it or mess with it. So now I'm going to go up to the top. Before we can get the upper strut bolts and nuts off on the shock tower, we have to move the master cylinder reservoir over a little bit to get access to this one. So I'm going to come in here with my 15 millimeter. Try to get in here. Undo this one on the right. Couldn't use the ratchet before because I couldn't get a long socket in there and the short one wasn't deep enough. I'm going to use it now to finish the job for the last couple threads. It's a little bit of a tight fit. There it is. Be careful not to drop it. I'm going to go find a deep 15 for this side. Okay, same problem. Maybe I can fish it just enough. These lines are a little bit in the way. Okay, make sure not to drop that nut. Now let's try to pull this forward. Okay, so we have two Torx here. Okay, so these Torx are T50s. Would have been nice if GM had done this in a way that they used all of the same hardware and the master cylinder reservoir wasn't in the way. Okay, that one's off. Let's see if I can get in here without completely taking everything off. Okay, so I want to show you the trick that I did. I just pulled the master cylinder off of the stud on the right, but I'm leaving it on the one on the left. Well, actually, this would be the right facing forward if you're sitting in the car, so the passenger side. I'm tilting it just enough to get on this so that I can leave this all on here. And I have just enough room to unthread this now. Takes a little bit of persuasion, but if you're careful, it works. See if I can hand thread this out now. Just about. There we go. Okay, so there it is. If these are 15s, they look like it. Yeah. So these ones are 15s. Just gonna crack these loose. Use my ratcheting wrench. Okay, so now our strut just fell out, which I expected, along with our upper control arm. So my way's a little bit unconventional, but it allows the upper control arm to come loose with the bracket on it, and I can get better access to the mounting bolts for the upper control arm. So I'm going to go ahead and take those off now. So I'm going to go ahead and bust upper control arm loose from the mounting bracket. I have an 18 on one side and the 15mm socket on the other. Okay, make quick work of that. There's one. There's the other. Okay, bracket's loose from my crusty old upper control arm. Tension's okay on my brake line. I should have mentioned when I was undoing the top nuts on the strut that you should support the lower control arm so it doesn't go collapsing down when those drop out of the strut tower and stretch your brake line too much. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and undo this castle nut, attaching our steering knuckle to our old upper control arm. Okay, now that I quickly busted the 15mm castle nut off of this ball joint on the upper control arm, I'm going to see if I can hammer it out. There we go. All right, now I'm ready to put my bracket back on and my strut back on the upper part. Okay, so I went ahead and set my bracket here on top of my strut, and with any luck by myself I'm going to be able to get this up in here at least through one hole so that I can then thread it. Not quite. I've got my upper control arm and strut assembly lifted up into place. These two on top of the shock tower, these nuts are 30 foot-pounds. The T50 Torx are 37 foot-pounds. And then I went ahead and put our master cylinder and reservoir back into place, got it slotted in, and those two nuts torqued to 21 foot-pounds. So now I'm going to go ahead and reposition our steering knuckle so that it lines up with our upper ball joint. So I just lifted up a little bit from the lower control arm. Let's try to get this to align better. Now we've got our ball joint through our steering knuckle, okay, and we can hang that from the top. So it's loosely held now at top and bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and get my lower strut assembly bolted back on to the lower control arm. To catch you up while I was changing batteries, I went ahead and installed the upper ball joint from the steering knuckle to the upper control arm, torqued that to 39 foot-pounds, and now I'm going back down to the lower control arm bolts, and I'm going to torque those to 74 foot-pounds. Getting close. Okay, there we go. Now the one that faces forward. Fortunately, I don't have a lot of swing here. I'll come at it from the bottom. Give me a little bit more. Okay. Now, rotate our steering knuckle. I'm going to go ahead and do up our castle nut. Okay, I went ahead and jacked up under the control arm a little bit just to get it a little bit more into position. Push that ball joint up through the steering knuckle. Just thread that castle nut on. And that one we're going to do up to 81 foot-pounds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and torque the lower strut nuts to the specified 48 foot-pounds. Okay, on our sway bar end links, this is now a 16 millimeter with the new hardware. And this is very light torque spec, 17 foot-pounds. Let's go a little faster. Okay, make sure that's not spinning again. Okay, we have our sway bar end link on there now, tightened to 17 foot-pounds. Just pushed up my outer tie rod end ball joint up into our steering knuckle. And then I'm just going to tighten this one up to the 52 foot-pounds that it was called for. Move this back. Okay, we'll tighten that just a little bit more so that we can reach the hole where the cotter pin goes through. So now I'm going to install my cotter pin in there. I'm going to install my cotter pin in my upper ball joint where the steering knuckle goes into the upper control arm, and then I'm just going to grease both of those fittings and this job is done. Today we are back on the 2000 Camaro SS, Project Childhood Dream Car, and we're going to be working on the steering and suspension a little bit because this car doesn't track very well and it's not steering very well. Not very surprising for a car with original parts that is a 2000. First I'm going to undo the two 15 millimeter nuts and the two 13 millimeter nuts that secure on our strut at the shock tower. This is the passenger side. Do note that if you're working on the driver's side, you'll have to remove the two nuts holding the brake master cylinder onto the firewall and move that over to get access to one of the bolts on that side. Okay, next I'm going to remove the two 13 millimeter fasteners that hold on the sway bar end link. And I have to do that by holding the one steady on the bottom while I undo the top. Okay, I had to reposition. As soon as this nut's off, this link will just drop out the bottom. And don't worry about the bushings because you have new ones with the new sway bar end links. Okay, got that out, just had to knock it out with the hammer. Quick tip, if you leave it in the order that it was removed, this will show you how you need to position your center sleeves and all of your bushings on the new piece. Bottom, top. Okay, now I'm going to remove the ball joint from the upper control arm. I just pulled the cotter pin out. You can go ahead and discard that because you should always put a new cotter pin in when you're reinstalling. So I'm going to undo the 15mm castle nut. Okay, I just went ahead and hammered on it a little bit to separate that ball joint from the upper control arm. And now that gives me movement. I can pull the steering knuckle away, but it's still attached at the bottom. Be mindful of your brake hose down here at the bottom so that you don't get a leak. So I want to be mindful that I don't stretch the brake hose too much and stress it and get a leak down here. So I've still got my tie rod end on. I still have the bottom ball joint in place, and that helps secure this. But what I would recommend is just being careful with that. And the reason that I went ahead and did it this way is I actually like to pull the upper control arm off as an assembly with the 4 mounting bolts for the strut that actually secure this top plate into place, because I can get a better purchase on these bolts to remove them from the plate and the upper control arm and then retorque them off the car. So you can see that's now loose. I'm going to go ahead and loosen down the 2 bottom mounting bolts on the strut, and then that will allow me to pull this aside. Okay, I did go ahead and secure the top of the steering knuckle just to keep stress off of this brake hose. Now I'm going to remove the 2 lower nuts on the strut, 15mm on the top, and it's held with 13 head on the bottom. So just loosen this up. Okay, that dropped out. Do the same on the other side, 15 on the top, 13 on the bottom. There it is. Now that's loose. I'm going to go ahead and pull this line away. Okay. There we go. Apologies, the camera keeps moving on us. So now, with the bottom loose, I can just drop the whole thing out. And I'm going to remove the upper control arm from this bracket. So real quick, with this whole assembly off, I'm going to try to separate this upper mounting bracket from the strut. There we go. And we don't need any of this anymore because our new strut has everything needed. And now you can see I have ample access to the bolts and nuts for the upper control arm and mounting bracket. Okay, real quick, I'm going to buzz these out by holding the 18mm nut, and I'm going to undo on the other end with the 15. Okay, that's out. And we'll just do the same to the other side. Okay, our upper control arm is now separated from the bracket. Our top bushing doesn't look good, but that's just because it's really dirty, but actually it's in okay shape. So we're going to go ahead and reuse that, and I'm going to put the new control arm on there. So one of the things that I like to do at this point is compare the position of the mounting of the old strut with the new, and then I will go ahead and twist this to be in the same plane and same orientation right to left, and it'll help you when you go to install to have all of your holes already lined up It's much easier than doing this when it's already up in there. And I just do that usually by taking a big wrench and twisting down and side to side as needed. But they're pretty close already. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little trick that I like to use. I took one of the bolts and one of the nuts off of the new strut assembly, and I put our mounting bracket and upper control arm up into place, and I slid that bolt and nut through it just to hold it in place because I'm by myself here and don't have a second set of hands. And this allows me to generally keep it up there in place while I go to slide in the new strut assembly from the top and get those threaded studs up in the front two holes. So up above, you can see I've got it sitting right there. And once I roughly get it into place, I will thread one of the studs through here, and then I can pull that back out and put it into place. Okay, so now with the strut pushed up through here on one of these studs, I just lightly threaded it, took the other bolt that was holding the bracket up, and pulled the nut off the bottom, so I can go ahead and now push this back through and start threading in the other hardware. Okay, with the other stud pushed up and the thread started, I can tighten these up a bit, which will pull the strut up higher and the bracket up higher. And now it gets my other two threads on the top of the strut relatively in place, and I can start working the bolts in there. Okay, and if you have any problems threading them in, don't cross thread it, but just jiggle a little bit from the bottom until you get the alignment right. So now I've snugged everything up, not super tight, a little on the loose end still, and that is so I can go down here and still just have a little play at the top. So looking down, you can see the bottom of my strut assembly. I got it slid over the wire and roughly into place. But the reason I'm leaving this a little loose is because now I think I'm going to attach the ball joint back to the steering knuckle, and that'll help hold this whole brake rotor and caliper assembly into place when I go to start detaching the bottom into the lower control arm. Okay, so with a jack supporting underneath the lower control arm, I put a little bit of pressure on there to raise the steering knuckle a little bit, and then I pulled down the upper control arm until it meets our new ball joint, threaded it a couple turns, and got that secured in there. So now the steering knuckle is supported by the upper control arm. Notice I also slotted a screwdriver in there just to keep that strut from possibly popping out under the compression pressure of the jack. So now that that's on there, shall be safe, and I'm going to release the pressure on the jack and start working on the lower portion after doing some torquing up at the top. These nuts should be torqued to 30 foot-pounds. And then 37 foot-pounds on the rear bolt. Okay, I had to do that last one with two hands. Okay, I'm now going to tighten this ball joint nut that goes into the steering knuckle and upper control arm to the specified 39 foot-pounds. Okay. Just do it a tad more so I can line my cotter pin hole up. I'm going to throw a new cotter pin in there. Okay, with our new cotter pin in, that wraps up the upper portion of this job. Strut assembly is in at the top, new control arms in and torqued, and our ball joint is secured to torque spec to the steering knuckle. Let's move down to the bottom. I'm going to start working on the lower part. I'm going to undo this jam nut on the outer tie rod end. Back that off a bit. And then one of the things that I like to do is mark the place where the tie rod is currently. That way when I put the new one on, it'll be relatively in alignment. Okay, so with my old Cotter pin out of there and discarded, I'm going to loosen the castle nut on the tie rod end. Now I'm going to hammer it out. There we go. And I'm not concerned about any of this at all because this is getting discarded. You can see the bushings absolutely shot on this. We've got our new tie rod in that we can put on there. So with that, just unthread it. Then we have our nice new moved part. Thread that on there until it's where my existing marks are. So this ends up right back in the same place. It's about right. Get my jam nut back on there. I'll go ahead and cinch that down later, just so I have a little bit of play here when I'm putting it back into place. And next I'm going to go ahead and separate this ball joint from the steering knuckle and our lower control arm. Okay, now with our cotter pin removed, I'm going to go ahead and undo this castle nut on this ball joint attaching the steering knuckle to the lower control arm. Okay. There it is. And now I should be able to knock that one out. Okay, it just took a little bit of persuasion with the sledgehammer. Now that one's loose. So finally, I'm going to go back and undo the two lower control arm bolts. The one at the rear goes up from underneath, and the front one goes from the front towards the back. So moving towards the back of the lower control arm, I undid this little wiring harness, and then I'm going to unclip at these 2 points that it's attached to the existing control arm so that we can separate that without damaging the wiring. And then I'm going to go in here, undo that fastener and the one that comes up from underneath there. Okay, with my 21mm socket on there, I'm just going to drive that off. Okay, that's off. And now I can push this one out. And it just slides out beneath the inner tie rod. So as you can see, I jacked up on the back of the control arm just a little bit to ease the pressure to get this mounting bolt out. And both of these bolts have this indexing tab on them. So when you go put that in, you got to make sure to get that lined up. And then I am going to go ahead and remove this bottom one. Okay, the nut's off. And then I find that it's easiest just to go around from the back to get the bolt. Okay, and just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I did, I pulled out the front one so I could rotate this back a little bit and pivot the angle a little bit until that bolt just popped right through, pushed it up from the bottom, and grabbed it. So now I can just pull this out. And that's all it takes to get the lower control arm out. Now let me show you something. The reason that this car is tracking so terribly and not handling well is because all of these bushings are worn out. The rubber is deteriorated, and when you get a little bit of flex in these joints, and then the upper control arms and the other ball joints going into the steering knuckle and the tie rod ends, once all that's combined, it makes for huge movements. Doesn't seem big when it's just one or two joints, but combined makes big difference. So now we're going to go ahead and slide our new lower control arm assembly in. Now what I did was, with one hand I just held the steering knuckle towards the back of the car a little bit while I slid in the control arm on the one back side, and then shimmied it into place until it was roughly below the mounting ears where the bolt goes through. And then I just put a jack up underneath the front part of it and lifted it into place. So now it's in there, and I'll go ahead and push the bolts through and get it all aligned. Okay, so at this point, with a little bit of finagling from underneath, a little bit of assistance from the jack to get things supported, I was able to push through that bolt and hand thread it along with the back mounting one. Now remember, both of these have indexing tabs. The one from the back faces towards the back, and this one is oriented at about 1 o'clock. So with those in there and hand tightened, I'm not torquing them yet. I want to go ahead and get my lower strut in position. So again, I supported with the jack and just lifted from underneath a little bit right here, and then was able, with a little tap of the hammer, to push our bolts through there and there, and then start hand threading them. Just be careful not to mess up the threads. So now I'm going to get those torqued down. Now with this steering knuckle pushed back forward out of our way, I'm going to go ahead and torque these strut bolts to the required 48 foot-pounds. Okay, now I'm going to go to the front, rotate this back. Off camera, I went under the car and I went ahead and torqued that bolt and that bolt, holding on our lower control arm to the specified torque of 74 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to rotate our steering knuckle back around, and I'm going to work on putting in our sway bar end link. I went ahead and put our sway bar end links in, did our bushing stack up, our sleeve just the way it's supposed to be, like the old one. Pushed this bolt up from the bottom, and I lightly tapped it up with a hammer until I could start threading up here, and then I just torqued this to the specified 17 foot-pounds. Very light torque. You don't need to torque these tight. And if it's a little off as far as the orientation to the sway bar itself, like this one is, that'll all work itself out as you drive the car. Next, I'm going to go ahead and put our lower ball joint into our steering knuckle. So I'll just slide that over, and then what I'm going to do is drive it up into here by putting the jack under it and lifting. There we go, I just needed the right angle. Okay, I'm going to put my castle nut on now. Okay, I'm going to take tension off. So now I can just use my socket to draw it up into there. Okay. And then the big castle nut, securing the ball joint to the lower control arm, gets torqued to 81 foot-pounds. There we go. Finally, this is secured back in place. I'm going to rotate it around, and I'm going to get our tie rod end put back in. I can just manipulate this angle so it lines up nicely. Show that. There's our new tie rod end. I can move the ball joint to an angle that just easily goes up in there, and I'm just going to lightly tap it. You don't want to mess this up, so go easy on it. It's just a couple light taps to get it enough to thread. Okay, so same story. Now we're just going to torque that to spec. Okay, now we're going to draw this in with our 18mm socket. And I'm going to torque it to the specified 47 foot-pounds. Okay, so now everything is reattached. We've got our sway bar end link attached. We've got our outer tie rod back in place. We've got our steering knuckle to control arm. We've got our steering knuckle to upper control arm. We've got our control arm to bracket done up to torque spec, and our struts on top and bottom the torque spec. So at this point, I'm just going to line up all of our castle nuts so we can put new cotter pins in. Cotter pin, that one's already done. And then we're going to go ahead and put the Zerk fittings on and get these joints greased. Got my cotter pin through there. And now these little guys that you often see come with your ball joints are your Zerk fittings, and these just screw on to each of your ball joints. You just thread them in real lightly, and then that allows you to grease up your ball joints. So I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera, but that pretty much wraps this job up. One thing I'll mention is that I do like to go back and retorque things after I've driven for a bit. Just that's my preference. Real quick as we wrap up, I thought I'd show you our accumulation of the old original parts. These struts are pretty sorry. They don't have much damping anymore in the shock. This lower control arm, the ball joints, they're all hardened. The rubber's cracking. A lot of play in those. So yeah, between all this, that's the cause of our steering issues and our lack of good aero straight highway behavior. So go test this out now and move on to the next project. Please give a thumbs up to the channel, subscribe, comment back. I'd love to hear from you, hear what you want to see more of, what you want to see less of, what you like, what you don't like, and I'll comment back. Helps me support the channel. Really appreciate it.